For decades, Chevrolet told the world a simple story. If you wanted real power, you needed a V8. Anything with fewer cylinders was just a compromise, a budget choice, a tool for trucks and work fleets. But what if that story was carefully constructed? What if one of the strongest, most overbuilt engines GM ever created was deliberately hidden from performance buyers? Buried under labels like industrial and heavy duty, this engine was quietly banned, restricted, and sidelined. Not because it was weak, but because it was too dangerous to the status quo. This is the story Chevrolet never wanted enthusiasts to question. Hiding the monster in plain sight. Picture this. It is 1963. You are standing in the middle of a Chevrolet showroom, surrounded by the smell of fresh rubber and high-octane optimism. In the front window, the dealer has parked the crown jewel of American performance, the Corvette Stingray. It is sleek, aggressive, and undeniably fast. Under the hood sits the legendary small-block V8, an engine that marketing executives have spent millions of dollars convincing you is the pinnacle of automotive engineering. But walk past the showroom, through the service bay, and out to the commercial lot in the back. There sits a grimy, utilitarian dump truck, or a school bus destined for a life of misery. Under its hood is an engine that General Motors absolutely did not want you to know about. It is the Chevrolet 292 Inline 6. And unbeknownst to the general public, that dirty truck engine was structurally superior to the V8 sitting in the Corvette. This is where the deception begins. For decades, the narrative handed down from Detroit was that the Inline 6 was a relic, a baseline motor for people who could not afford power. The V8 was the future. The V8 was speed. To maintain this hierarchy, General Motors engaged in one of the most successful marketing stratagems in industrial history. They looked at the 292, an engine capable of handling abuse that would shatter a small block, and they slapped a label on it. They called it industrial. They called it heavy duty. These were not badges of honor. They were warning signs intended to scare away the youth market. By categorizing the 292 as a workhorse, Chevy effectively made it invisible to the hot rodders and street racers of the era. The suits and marketing understood the psychology of the car buyer perfectly. If you tell a 19-year-old kid that an engine is for a garbage truck, he is not going to put it in his Camaro. He is going to buy the V8 because he wants to go fast. But the reality was that GM was terrified of internal product cannibalization. The profit margins on the Supersport packages and high-performance V8 upgrades were massive. If the buying public realized they could get V8 crushing torque and superior durability from a simple six-cylinder, the prestige of the V8 would crumble, and with it, the company's most lucrative revenue stream. This protectionism went beyond just clever naming conventions. It shaped the physical engineering of the engine itself. The 292 was designed with a tall deck block. The engineers added exactly 1.75 inches of extra metal to the top of the block compared to the standard passenger car engines. While this allowed for a massive stroke, it served a secondary, tactical purpose. That extra height meant the engine physically would not fit under the low, sleek hoods of the Chevy Nova or the Chevelle without significant modification. It was a structural firewall. By making the engine too tall for a passenger car, GM ensured that no casual enthusiast would accidentally discover its potential. While the smaller, weaker 230 and 250 cubic inch engines were happily sold in base model sedans, the 292 was strictly blacklisted. It was sequestered to the truck division, locked away behind a wall of hood clearance issues and marketing lies. They kept the 230 and 250 in the public eye because those engines were safe. They were adequate, but they were not threats. The 292, however, was a monster. It had to be kept in the basement, hidden behind the label of industrial necessity, because General Motors knew that if they let it out, it wouldn't just compete with the V8, it might just kill it. Accidental perfection under the hood. When you strip an engine down to its bare iron soul, marketing budgets stop mattering and physics takes over. This is where the Chevrolet 292 reveals its true nature. While the automotive world was worshiping the small block 5.8, the engineers in the truck division were quietly assembling a bottom end that was structurally superior to almost everything else in the General Motors catalog. The secret lies in the architecture of the block itself, specifically the main bearings. The legendary small block 5.8 utilizes a 5-main bearing design. This means that while the crankshaft is supported, There are gaps in that support structure that allow for flexibility under extreme load. When you push a V8 to its absolute limit, the crankshaft can actually bend and whip inside the block, a phenomenon known as crankshaft deflection. This movement transfers violent energy into the main caps, causing them to walk or shuffle, which eventually destroys the engine. The 292 Inline 6 does not have this problem. It was built with 7 main bearings. This means the crankshaft is fully supported on both sides of every single cylinder throw. The resulting rigidity is absolute. You could subject this bottom end to cylinder pressures that would twist a V8 crank into a pretzel, and the 292 would simply keep rotating. But geometry is only half the story. The material science involved here is even more telling of GM's unintentional brilliance. During this era, if you bought a standard V8 passenger car, your engine came with a cast nodular iron crankshaft. These were made by pouring molten iron into a mold. It is a cost-effective process, but it leaves the metal with a somewhat brittle, random molecular structure and a tensile strength of around 80,000 psi. It is fine for a daily driver, but it is the weak link in a race car. The 292, however, came standard with a forged steel crankshaft. Forging is a violent, expensive process where a solid ingot of steel is heated and hammered into shape under massive hydraulic dies. This aligns the grain structure of the metal, following the contours of the crank, and results in a component with a tensile strength exceeding 120,000 psi. General Motors put this race-grade hardware into the 292 because they thought dump truck drivers needed the durability. They accidentally gave the industrial market a crankshaft capable of handling 1,000 horsepower. This durability was necessary because of the sheer violence of the 292's geometry. The engine features a massive stroke of 4.125 inches. To put that in perspective, the ubiquitous 350 V8 has a stroke of only 3.48 inches. Even the big block 396 has a shorter stroke than the 292. In mechanical terms, stroke is leverage. A longer stroke acts like a longer wrench turning a bolt. It generates massive amounts of torque instantaneously. General Motors knew they had a problem. They had built an engine that was stronger and torqueier than their flagship V8 Wes. So, they found a technical excuse to banish it. They pointed to the engine's harmonics. Because the inline 6 crankshaft is so long, it acts like a torsion bar, twisting slightly as it spins. This creates a resonant vibration, specifically a third-order harmonic, that occurs right around 4,740 RPM. GM engineers waved this data around, claiming the engine would shake itself to pieces in a sports car application. In reality, this was a manageable quirk. With a quality fluid dampener and proper balancing, that vibration is a non-issue. But it gave the executives exactly what they needed, a scientific-sounding reason to keep their best engineering work out of the hands of speed freaks. The verdict from Floor 14. The most controversial chapter in the history of the Chevrolet, 292 does not exist in any official sales brochure or dealership manual. It exists in the whispered accounts of retired engineers and the fringed edges of automotive folklore. It is the story of Project X6. In the mid-60s, a small group of rogue engineers within Chevrolet decided to test the validity of the corporate ban. They recognized that the 292 was effectively a race engine in work clothes. So, they pulled a few units off the truck assembly line, fitted them with experimental aluminum heads and multi-carburetor setups, and dropped them into the engine bays of the newly introduced 1967 Camaro and the Chevelle. The results of these unauthorized tests were not just promising, they were politically dangerous. The data showed that a properly tuned 292 prototype could match the acceleration of the highly touted 327 cubic inch V8, sprinting from 0 to 60 miles per hour in roughly 6.5 seconds. But straight-line speed was only half the equation. The test drivers reported something even more alarming for the V8 loyalists. The 6-cylinder cars simply drove better. This handling advantage came down to a concept known as the polar moment of inertia. A V8 engine is wide and heavy, often placing significant mass over the front axle, which makes the car reluctant to change direction quickly. The inline 6, by contrast, is long and narrow. This configuration allowed the engineers to center the engine's weight along the longitudinal axis of the chassis, with the mass concentrated closer to the center of the car rather than hanging over the front wheels. The Camaro turned in with a crispness and precision that the nose-heavy V8 models could not hope to replicate. The The 292 prototype was a balanced, torque-rich sports car that was cheaper to manufacture and easier to maintain than its V8 counterparts. And that was exactly why it had to die. The findings of Project X6 eventually made their way up to the 14th floor of the General Motors building, the seat of executive power where engineering excellence often went to die at the hands of financial strategy. The executives on floor 14 were not interested in the best car. They were interested in the best margin. The V8 was the prestige product. It was the cultural icon of the brand. The entire marketing strategy of Chevrolet was built on the idea that more cylinders equaled more status. If the public discovered that a 6-cylinder engine could embarrass a 327 V8 on a road course, the hierarchy of the option sheet would collapse. Why would a customer pay a premium for a supersport package if the base engine was faster? The decision from floor 14 was swift and absolute. Project X6 was not canceled because it failed. It was canceled because it succeeded too well. The directive was issued to bury the high-performance 292 program and ensure the engine remains strictly sequestered in the industrial division. The 292 was stripped of its racing potential and sent back to the assembly line to haul manure and deliver mail. A victim of corporate sabotage designed to protect the profitable supremacy of the V8. Sabotage by the numbers. By the time the 1970s arrived, the golden age of horsepower was over. The smog era had begun, and Detroit was scrambling to comply with strangulating emissions regulations. But while most engines suffocated under primitive exhaust gas recirculation systems, the Chevrolet 292 remained surprisingly resilient due to its massive torque reserves. However, General Motors saw this era not as a challenge to be overcome, but as an opportunity to finally bury their Inline 6 deep in the catalog. They did this through a masterclass in statistical manipulation, known as the SAE Net Rating System. In 1972, the industry switched from measuring horsepower on a stand with no accessories, known as SAE Gross, to measuring it as installed in the vehicle, with mufflers, alternators, and air cleaners attached, known as SAE Net. This shift caused numbers to drop across the board, but for the 292, the drop was catastrophic by design. GM published ratings as low as 120 horsepower for the 292. On paper, it looked pathetic. It looked like a lawnmower engine compared to the V8S. But in the real world, a 120 horsepower 292 in a C10 pickup would frequently outpull a smog-choked 350 V8 when towing a heavy load up a grade. The paper numbers were a deception, a paper tiger, created to convince buyers that the V8 was the only option for real work, even as the Inline 6 was doing the heavy lifting. As the decade wore on and the oil crisis hit, the demand for fuel efficiency should have saved the Inline 6. The natural evolution for the 292 was electronic fuel injection, but GM North America claimed this was an engineering impossibility. They pointed to the cylinder head design, which featured Siamese intake ports. In this configuration, two cylinders share a single intake runner. The engineers argued that because of the Inline 6 firing order, 1, 5, 3, 6, 2, 4, the airflow dynamics made multi-port injection impossible. The math they presented was daunting. When two cylinders share a port, they don't pull air evenly. The trailing cylinder in the firing order effectively steals the charge from the leading cylinder. Calculations showed that the second cylinder would inhale up to 2/3 of the fuel, leaving the first cylinder to starve and run dangerously lean. GM threw up their hands, declared the problem unsolvable, and left the 292 to rot with a carburetor. But this was a lie. We know it was a lie because of what was happening 3,000 miles away. In Brazil, the Chevrolet subsidiary was producing the Opala, a luxury car powered by the same basic Inline 6 architecture. Did the Brazilian engineers give up? No. They developed sophisticated intake manifolds and port injection systems that managed the airflow perfectly. They turned the Chevy Inline 6 into a high-tech, fuel-injected powerhouse. The technology existed. The solution was proven. GM North America simply refused to spend the money to implement it. Instead of modernizing the superior 292, they killed it in favor of the 4.3-liter V6. The V6 was not a better engine. It was rough. It was unbalanced, and it lacked the harmonic smoothness of the inline layout. But it had one massive corporate advantage. It was just a 350 small block with 2 cylinders chopped off. It used the same pistons, the same rods, and the same accessories as the V8. The 292 was sacrificed not because it was obsolete, but to protect the supply chain of the V8 ecosystem. Banned for winning too much. The boardroom is where the lies are written, but the racetrack is where the truth gets told. And when the Chevrolet 292 finally made it to the starting line, the truth was embarrassing for everyone who had invested their ego in a V8. In the world of drag racing and circle track competition, displacement usually wins. But in the early 70s, the 292 began to dominate so thoroughly that the sanctioning bodies had to step in and rig the game to stop it. This regulatory sabotage was most visible in the NHRA stock and super stock classes. Originally, cars were classified by their factory horsepower rating. A Nova with a 292 was rated at roughly 165 horsepower. Based on its weight, it fit into a specific class where it should have been competitive, but not dominant. The problem was torque. The 292 made so much low-end power that it would launch off the line while the high-revving V8 Wests were still waiting for their power bands to kick in. The 6-cylinder cars started wiping the floor with the V8 Wests. The NHRA's response was a controversial process called factoring. Instead of using the factory rating, they arbitrarily assigned a new, higher horsepower number to the 292. They effectively said, "We know the brochure says 165, but we are going to race you as if you have 220 horsepower." The math was brutal. In a class requiring 13 pounds per horsepower, that artificial bump meant the 292 driver had to add over 700 pounds of lead ballast to their car. Imagine trying to drag race with 3 extra grown men sitting in the back seat. That was the only way they could get the V80S back in the winner's circle. But if the drag strip was unfair, the dirt tracks of the Midwest were a war zone. On the clay ovals, the 292 earned the nickname the cheater engine. This wasn't about weight penalties, it was about physics. Specifically, the physics of traction. On a dry, slick dirt track, maintaining grip is everything. A V8 engine fires every 90 degrees of crankshaft rotation. It creates a constant high-frequency stream of power pulses. It's like a machine gun. On a slippery surface, that constant barrage breaks the tire loose, and you just spin the wheels. The 292 is different. Because of its firing interval and massive stroke, it delivers power in distinct rhythmic hammers. Boom, boom, boom. Between each power pulse, there is a microsecond of recovery time. This tiny gap allows the tire tread to relax and bite into the dirt before the next hammer blow arrives. It is called pulse recovery. While the V8 guys were spinning their tires into a frenzy, the 292 would simply hook up and drive away. The advantage was so profound that track promoters faced a revolt. V8 racers, who spent thousands on their engines, threatened to quit because they were getting beaten by junkyard truck motors. To save the show, promoters started banning the 292 entirely. Some tracks even mandated a bizarre modification called the Big Bang, or even fire setup. Forcing 292 builders to alter the crankshaft, they banned it because it was unbeatable. The 1,000 horsepower reality. The decades of marketing lies, corporate suppression, and regulatory handicapping eventually ran out of time. In the 21st century, the truth about the Chevrolet 292 finally surfaced, not through a press release from General Motors, but through the empirical violence of the dyno cell. Modern engine builders, armed with turbochargers and precise electronic fuel injection, have stripped away the industrial disguise to reveal what was hiding underneath all along. The data is no longer theoretical. It is absolute proof that the 292 was never just a truck motor. It was a race engine that got lost on its way to the track. The most damning piece of evidence against the old workhorse narrative comes from the Staff Bros garage. They took a high-mileage 292 engine block that had spent its life powering a UPS delivery truck. This was an engine that had likely idled for thousands of hours and hauled packages through city traffic. They didn't replace the block with a custom aftermarket unit. They didn't swap out the crankshaft for a billet racing component. They used the factory iron block and the factory forged steel crankshaft. Then, they strapped a massive turbocharger to it and turned up the boost. On the dyno, that tired delivery truck engine produced 1,320 horsepower. Let that number sink in. To achieve 1,300 horsepower with a small block 5.8, you cannot use a production block. If you put 42 pounds of boost into a stock 350 block, it will split down the middle long before you reach 4 digits. To build a V8 capable of handling that kind of pressure, you have to buy an aftermarket dart or bow tie block, which can cost upwards of $10,000 just for the raw casting. The 292 achieves the same structural integrity. With a piece of iron you can pull out of a junkyard for a few $100. The safety margin that GM engineers claimed was necessary for hauling gravel was, in reality, a massive performance overhead that they were terrified to unleash on the street. The final barrier to unlocking this potential was the cylinder head. For years, the 292 suffered from a restrictive intake port design, where a head bolt boss protruded directly into the airstream, choking off the flow. This was the technical flaw that critics always pointed to. But modern ingenuity solved that too. Enter Tom Lowe and the lump port revolution. Enthusiasts discovered that they could machine away the iron boss that blocked the air and install a streamlined aluminum insert, known as a lump, into the floor of the port. This modification corrects the geometry of the intake runner. By smoothing the short turn radius and removing the obstruction, the airflow characteristics of the head are fundamentally transformed. When combined with modern valves and a turbocharger, the lump port head flows enough air to support power levels that rival dedicated race engines. It was the final key to the puzzle, proving that the engine's only real weakness was a casting decision that could be fixed with a mill and a piece of aluminum. The verdict is now undeniable. The Floor 14 Inches executives were right to be afraid. They knew that they were selling a product in their commercial division that was mechanically superior to the product in their performance division. If they had allowed the 292 to be developed properly, if they had offered it in the Camaro with a cross-flow head and fuel injection, the history of the American muscle car would have looked very different. The V8 would not have been the undisputed king, it would have been the expensive, fragile alternative to the invincible 6. The 292 is the greatest engine that Chevrolet never wanted you to buy, a masterpiece of over-engineering that survived 40 years of suppression to finally take its place at the top of the horsepower food chain. The uncrowned king of Detroit. The story of the Chevrolet 292 is not just a story about cast iron and gasoline. It is a cautionary tale about the conflict between engineering excellence and corporate survival. We are often taught to believe that the free market is a meritocracy where the best technology naturally rises to the top. We assume that if an engine is stronger, more durable, and more efficient, it will become the standard. But the history of this inline 6 proves that in the automotive industry, the best product does not always win. Sometimes the best product is the most dangerous one. General Motors had a choice in the mid-20th century. They possessed a platform with the structural rigidity of a diesel and the potential of a race car. They had the 7-main bearing architecture, the forged steel internals, and the torque characteristics to revolutionize the American performance market. The 292 could have been the foundation for a new era of sports cars, lighter and better handling than their V8 counterparts. But that future was sacrificed to protect the golden goose. The small block 5.8 was not just an engine, it was a brand, a lifestyle, and most importantly, a high-margin profit center. To preserve that ecosystem, GM had to suppress their own masterpiece. They buried it under false labels of industrial necessity. They took minor engineering challenges like torsional harmonics and port airflow and framed them as insurmountable fatal flaws. We now know this was a lie. The harmonic vibrations were manageable. The breathing restrictions were solvable. These were not dead ends. They were merely excuses used to justify the sequestration of an engine that threatened to cannibalize sales of the Supersport packages. The executives on Floor 14 looked at the data and realized that a bulletproof 6-cylinder would make their prestige V8S look fragile and overpriced. So, the next time you are at a car show or walking through a salvage yard and you see that long, tall orange valve cover sitting in the engine bay of a rusted pickup, do not look at it with pity. Do not think of it as a boat anchor that needs to be swapped out for an LS. You are looking at a survivor. You are looking at a machine that was built with a level of integrity that the modern automotive industry has long since abandoned. It is a sleeping giant, a mechanical testament to what happens when engineers are allowed to overbuild without the interference of accountants. Its legacy is defined not by the work it did, but by the potential it was forced to hide. It remains the strongest heart GM ever built, which is exactly why they stopped it from beating.